This is a work of cinematic fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, locations, and events are completely invented. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental. He signed her out of his life the way he signed contracts without looking up. Adrian Voss sat at the marble desk in the center of the penthouse's main room, a pen loose between two fingers, and the divorce papers were right there, fanned open under the chandelier light, and he hadn't touched them yet, hadn't needed to. His lawyer had already walked Elena through the terms. His head of security, Caleb Rourke, had already packed her things. One suitcase, the battered brown leather one she'd brought to the marriage, not the Goyard luggage he'd bought her, not the jewelry she'd worn at his events, not the phone his company paid for. He'd had Caleb cut the service that afternoon. $11 was what she had in the pocket of her coat. Adrian knew that. He'd been told. He hadn't corrected it. Elena Marlowe stood at the edge of the room and did not cry. That was the thing that bothered him, somewhere low and quiet, a place he'd learned to shut off. She did not beg. She did not argue. She looked at the unsigned divorce papers on the table. Then she picked up the suitcase and she walked toward the private elevator, without another word. Adrian said her name once. She stopped. She didn't turn around. "The papers need your signature before you go," he said. "Sign them yourself," she said. "You're good at doing things without me." The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. The doors closed. Adrian stared at the empty space she'd left in the room, and then he picked up his pen and he signed his name on the first page of the documents. Clean, precise, the way he did everything, and then he stopped. He didn't know why he stopped. He told himself it was the logistics. There were 7 more pages. He'd finish in the morning. He walked to the window. 43 floors below, Elena came through the lobby doors into the rain. He could see her from up here, small, the suitcase in one hand, her coat already soaked at the shoulders. She stood at the curb. She didn't look up. She didn't call anyone. She just stood there in the rain on 57th Street at 2:17 in the morning, and Adrian watched her, and something in his chest did something he did not have a word for. Then the sky above Manhattan began to roar. It was not thunder. Adrian turned his head before the sound registered fully, a low building pressure in the glass, a vibration that climbed up from the floor through his shoes. He looked east, toward the dark corridor above the river, and he saw the running lights before he saw the shape. A private jet. Black fuselage, no visible markings from this distance, banking in a wide arc above the city, before descending toward the private airfield on the other side of the bridge. He had 3 aircraft of his own. He knew the sound of all of them. This wasn't one of his. His phone was already in his hand. He called the airfield's direct line before the jet had finished its descent. Dominic, his airfield manager, picked up on the second ring. The man's voice was wrong, immediately. Too careful, too controlled, the particular tone of someone trying not to say what they needed to say. "Talk to me," Adrian said. "Sir, we've got an unscheduled landing." The aircraft filed a last-minute flight plan from Zurich. Came through clean, all the right codes. No red flags in the system. The registration. What registration? A pause. Short, but heavy. Marlowe Industries, sir. Private charter. Registered to the family trust. Adrian said nothing for 4 seconds. "How many people?" he asked. "The manifest lists a crew of 3 and 12 passengers. They're armed, sir. We ran the body heat scan when they came in low enough. Every one of them is carrying." Adrian put the phone down without ending the call. He walked back to the window. Elena was still at the curb below, and now she wasn't alone. A car had pulled up. Black, no plates he could read from this height, and a man was climbing out of the passenger side. He reached Elena, said something to her. She shook her head. He said something else. She looked up then, not at the penthouse, not at Adrian's window, but at the sky, tracking the jet's descent. Her expression, even from 43 floors up, told Adrian everything he didn't want to know. She'd been expecting this. Caleb Rourke came through the penthouse door 90 seconds later without knocking. He was already dressed, which meant he'd never gone to sleep, which meant he'd known something was moving tonight and hadn't said a word about it to Adrian until this moment. That fact sat in the back of Adrian's mind like a splinter small, easy to ignore, but it was there.
"The Marlowe plane,"
Adrian said before Caleb could speak. We know. Caleb crossed the room in 4 long strides and stood beside him at the window, both of them looking down at the street where Elena and the man from the car were talking. I've got 6 men already heading to the airfield. We can lock the runway before the passengers disembark fully. Don't. Caleb looked at him. Don't lock anything, Adrian said. Not yet. Tell your men to hold position outside the perimeter and watch. He turned away from the window. Who authorized that plane? Nobody on our side. The filing came in from a private aviation attorney in Zurich. The Marlowe family trust has been dormant. For years, I mean years, Adrian. Since before you and Elena were married. Someone reactivated it in the last 72 hours. Elena. We don't know. It was Elena. Adrian said it flat. Without heat, and that was worse than anger, somehow, even to Caleb, who had known him for 15 years. She had 3 days' notice before the filing. She knew the divorce was coming before I told her. Somebody told her. Caleb's jaw shifted slightly. You think she had someone inside? I think she's been playing something I didn't see. Adrian picked up the unsigned divorce papers from the table and looked at them. Then he set them back down. Pull her financials again. Everything. Any account she's touched in the past 6 months. Any call she's made from a non-company device. Already running it. And get me the Marlowe file. The old one. The one from before the merger talks. Caleb went still for just a fraction of a second. A fraction. It was the kind of stillness that most people would miss entirely. Adrian didn't miss it. He'd spent his life reading men in the moment before they decided to lie, and Caleb's face in that fraction of a second was the face of a man who had just run a very fast internal calculation. That file's in the archive, Caleb said. Give me until morning. I want it in an hour. Caleb nodded once and left. Adrian stood alone in the penthouse with the divorce papers unsigned on the table, and his wife in the rain 43 floors below, and the sound of a Marlowe jet settling onto a runway on the other side of the bridge. And he felt for the first time in 15 years of building an empire on the principle that he controlled every variable, like he was standing in a room whose walls had been moved 3 inches without anyone telling him. Car Elena got into was not the Marlowe car. That was the first thing she told the man who'd climbed out to meet her, a compact, broad-shouldered man named Garrett, who had worked for her family since she was 19, and who smelled now, as he always had, cedar and gun oil. People are at the airfield, he said. I know. That's not where I'm going. Elena put the suitcase in the back seat herself. Old habit. She didn't like people handling the suitcase. How much time do we have before Adrian's men get there? They're already there. 6 of them. Holding the perimeter, which means he told them to watch and not move yet, which means he's thinking. Elena got in the passenger seat. Good. That's good. Garrett got behind the wheel. He looked at her profile in the rain-gray dark. You look terrible. I haven't slept in 2 days. The plan is already running. She put her head back against the seat. Her hands, folded in her lap, were not shaking, but only because she was actively preventing them from doing so. Caleb will go to him with a story in the next hour. Adrian will either believe it or he won't. If he believes it, we have about 6 hours before things go bad. If he doesn't believe it, then he figures it out on his own and we have less time. Less time, but we're standing on the right side of it. She closed her eyes. Drive, not the airfield. The warehouse on Pier 14. Garrett drove. The city moved past the windows, wet and yellow and loud at 2A. In the way that Manhattan is always loud, even when it's supposed to be quiet. Elena kept her eyes closed for exactly 4 minutes. She was not sleeping. She was running the sequence in her head, the way she had run it every night for the past 8 months, looking for the leak, the gap, the place where she'd made a calculation that would come apart under the wrong kind of pressure. The divorce had not been part of her calculation. She'd known it was coming. Caleb had been laying the groundwork for it for months, feeding Adrian half-truths about Elena's behavior, adjusting the financial reports in ways that made it look like she was skimming accounts, leaving small deliberate traces in the data that pointed at her instead of at him. She'd seen him doing it. She'd let him do it. Stopping him too early would have exposed her hand before the evidence was complete, and the evidence had to be complete, because Adrian Voss did not move on incomplete evidence. He never had. But she had underestimated how much Caleb had poisoned him. The divorce papers had arrived 3 days ahead of her own timeline, and that had forced the plane, which had forced tonight, which meant that everything was now accelerated in ways she hadn't fully accounted for. And the suitcase in the back seat contained the only thing that could fix it, and she hadn't opened it since she'd left the penthouse, and she wouldn't until she was somewhere Caleb's cameras couldn't see. The car stopped at a red light. Elena opened her eyes. In the reflection of the rain-soaked window beside her, she saw herself, and she saw something behind her face that surprised her. Not fear. Something older than fear. Something that looked, if she was being honest with herself, in the specific way that 2AM tends to demand, like grief. She'd loved Adrian Voss in spite of every reason not to. She had no room for that tonight. She closed her eyes again. The Marlowe file arrived on Caleb's desk, not Adrian's. That was the first thing Adrian noticed when the hour was up, and Caleb came back to the penthouse. He came back empty-handed, standing in the doorway, with an expression carefully arranged into professional concern. And Adrian knew before Caleb opened his mouth that whatever he was about to be told was a version of the truth with something critical missing from the center of it. "The archive copy is incomplete," Caleb said. "There are files from the original Marlowe merger talks that appear to have been pulled recently. I think Elena may have accessed the archive remotely. She didn't have that access. She shouldn't have." Caleb stepped fully into the room. "Adrian, I need to show you something." He laid a tablet on the marble table next to the divorce papers. On the screen was a surveillance image timestamp from 3 weeks ago, grainy, taken from what looked like a parking structure camera. The image showed Elena, with a man Adrian didn't recognize, passing something between them. Small, flat. The kind of exchange that is designed to look casual and fails completely at it when you're watching from above. Adrian looked at the image for a long time. "Who is he? We're running facial recognition. But the location is the problem. That parking structure is 2 blocks from the Santoro building. The Santoro family. The one rival operation in the city that Adrian had spent 4 years systematically dismantling. The one organization that had the infrastructure and the motive to absorb pieces of Adrian's empire if they could find the right leverage points to pull it apart from the inside. You're telling me my wife is running information to the Santoros. I'm telling you that image exists," Caleb said carefully. "I'm not drawing conclusions. I'm showing you what I found." Adrian picked up the tablet. He looked at Elena's posture, and the image relaxed, slightly turned, not facing the camera, and he thought about her face at the elevator doors, and he thought about 12 armed men on a Marlowe jet, and he thought the pressure until the light changed, and he thought about the $11 he'd left her with, and he thought about the fact that Caleb had come back without the file he'd been asked to retrieve. He set the tablet down. "Get me the original timestamp metadata on this image," he said. Caleb blinked. "What?" "The file metadata. The creation timestamp. I want to see when this image was actually recorded versus when it was actually saved to our surveillance server." He looked at Caleb directly. Because a grainy image from a parking camera should be a continuous feed file, which means its saved to server timestamp should be within 30 seconds of its recorded timestamp. If there's a gap, someone added it to our system after the fact. Caleb's expression did not change, but his right hand, hanging at his side, made a single slight movement. Kind of movement a person makes when they're deciding whether to reach for something that isn't there. "I'll have the tech team pull it," Caleb said. "I want it in 20 minutes. Caleb left. Adrian stood in the empty penthouse with the image on the tablet and the unsigned divorce papers on the table, and the sound of rain against the floor-to-ceiling glass, and he thought about 15 years. About the man who had stood at his right hand for all of it. About the particular calculus of loyalty, what it costs, what it looks like when it's real, what it looks like when it's been constructed. He picked up the divorce papers. He walked to the window. Below, the car that had picked Elena up was gone. The curb was empty. The rain was thinner now, settling into a mist that swallowed the streetlights. Adrian held the divorce papers over the floor-to-ceiling glass and stood there, looking at the city. He didn't tear them. He didn't sign them. He just held them. The warehouse at Pier 14 smelled of salt and rust and diesel. Elena sat on an overturned crate in the center of the space, the suitcase open on the floor in front of her, and Garrett stood 6 feet back, with his hands loose at his sides, watching the door. Inside the suitcase, under the false bottom she'd had installed in Zurich 7 months ago, was a small lockbox, matte black. The key to it hung on a chain around her neck, under her shirt, where it had been for the past 212 days. She lifted the lockbox out, set it on the crate beside her. Didn't open it yet. If Adrian pulls the metadata on that image, she said, Caleb's in trouble tonight instead of tomorrow. What's in the box is still the same either way. The box changes what happens after the trouble. Elena wrapped her hand around the lockbox. The metal was cold. Everything in here was cold. Caleb has been moving pieces of Adrian's operation to the Santoros for 2 years. Slowly. The kind of slowly that doesn't show up unless you know where to look. He built a parallel accounting structure inside 3 of Adrian's legitimate subsidiaries, shell within a shell within a shell. The offshore accounts that feed it are registered to a holding company in Malta. She paused. My brother found it. Garrett was quiet. Daniel found it 14 months ago, Elena said. Called me. He told me what he had. He said he was going to bring it to Adrian directly. And 3 days later, Daniel's car went off Route 9 into the reservoir. Her voice didn't change. It stayed the same level it had been. But her jaw tightened, and she looked at the lockbox instead of at Garrett, and she did not continue speaking for a moment. They ruled it an accident. Rain, bad visibility, no guardrail on that stretch. I knew. She pressed her thumb against the top of the lockbox. I've known since the day of the funeral. Elena, I need you to understand what's in this box, she said, cutting across him quietly. It's not just the financial records. It's the communication logs between Caleb and the Santoro intermediary. It's the transfer documentation, and it's the call record, a 6-minute call between a number registered to one of Caleb's personal devices, and the last number my brother dialed before his car went into the water. Garrett's voice, when it came, was very careful. That connects Caleb to Daniel's death. It connects him to the order. Whether it holds in a courtroom is someone else's problem. What it does right now tonight is give Adrian a reason to choose. She looked up from the lockbox. He's going to be handed a story about me before morning. Caleb already started building it. I saw the groundwork going in weeks ago. Surveillance images, financial anomalies, all of it designed to make Adrian believe I married him to destroy him. She stood up. I need Adrian to see this before he decides what to believe. And if he doesn't believe you, even after he sees it, Elena looked at Garrett. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then, I still put this in front of every faction head in his organization, she said. I still expose Caleb. I still make sure the evidence reaches the right people. She picked up the lockbox. Adrian's safety was never contingent on him believing me. I was protecting him before he knew he needed it. I'll protect him after, if it comes to that. Garrett looked at her for a long time. You stayed in that marriage for 2 years, protecting a man who just threw you out with $11. I stayed in that marriage, Elena said, because 2 bloodlines were about to burn each other down, and someone had to stand in the middle. She slipped the lockbox into her coat. And because I made a choice a long time ago, that I'm not ashamed of, even when it's cost me things I can't get back. Outside, the harbor water moved against the pilings, with the patient, in different rhythm of something that has been doing this, long before any of the current trouble started, and will go on doing it long after. Elena buttoned her coat. Get the car, she said. We're going to the airfield. 3:49 a.m., Adrian Voss's phone rang. It was his head of tech security, a woman named Priya, who had been with the organization for 6 years, and who had, to Adrian's knowledge, never once made a call at this hour for a reason that turned out to be minor. The metadata, she said. And the surveillance image Caleb brought you. Adrian was already standing when she called, still at the window, the divorce papers on the table behind him. Tell me. The recorded timestamp on the image is from 3 weeks ago. The save-to-server timestamp is from 11 hours ago. A pause. Someone inserted that file into our surveillance archive tonight, sir. After 11 p.m. After Elena had been told about the divorce. After Caleb had been in the archive. Adrian said nothing for a moment. Then Priya. I need you to pull every internal communication between Caleb's Access account and our subsidiary financial servers. Everything from the past 2 years. I need it without Caleb knowing you're pulling it, and I need it before sunrise. That's... She stopped. He could hear her understanding arriving. "Yes, sir. Give me 90 minutes." He hung up. He stood at the window. He thought about a woman in a coat in the rain with $11. He thought about a fabricated image. He thought about 15 years. Then he picked up a different phone, the one without the company SIM, and he dialed a number he hadn't called in a long time. It rang 3 times before a man picked up with the specific wariness of someone who answers unknown calls at 4 a.m. and has reason to expect bad news from them. "This is Adrian Voss," Adrian said. "I need to talk to someone in the Marlowe organization. Tonight. In person." The line was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mr. Voss, we were expecting your call. Miss Marlowe said you'd come around." Adrian closed his eyes briefly. Then he put his coat on, and he walked past the unsigned divorce papers without stopping, and he took the private elevator down. The airfield was wet and fluorescent and smelled of jet fuel when Garrett's car pulled through the secondary gate. Elena saw Adrian's vehicle the moment they cleared the fence line, one of his, a dark gray SUV, parked at the edge of the runway apron with the engine still running. He was standing beside it. Not inside it, beside it. Coat on, no security detail visible. Just him in the fluorescent runway light with his hands in his pockets, watching the Marlowe jet's tail lights, and he looked, Elena thought, from 40 yards away through the wet windshield, like a man who had spent the last 2 hours arriving at a conclusion he didn't like and had decided to show up anyway. Garrett stopped the car. Elena didn't move immediately. "You want me with you?" Garrett asked. "Stay here." She got out. The wind off the runway was cold and tasted of the coming morning. She walked toward Adrian, and he watched her come, and neither of them said anything until she was close enough that they could hear each other without raising their voices. "The metadata on the surveillance image," she said. "I know," he said. "Caleb built the file tonight, after you told me about the divorce." "I know." His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing the thing they did when he was holding on to something very hard. "What's in the suitcase, Elena?" Not a question. The kind of sentence that has already accepted that the answer is going to be significant. She looked at him for a moment. The runway lights made everything harsh and flat and too bright for 4 a.m. Honesty. But there it was, anyway, the two of them standing on wet tarmac in the cold, the Marlowe jet behind her, his unsigned divorce papers, somewhere in the penthouse above the city, and 15 years of things neither of them had said directly arranging themselves in the space between them. "Evidence," she said. "Everything Caleb has been doing to your organization. Financial transfer structure, the Santoro connection, the account records." She reached into her coat and held up the lockbox. "And the call record that connects him to my brother's death." Adrian's expression did not move, but his breathing changed. It was slight, barely perceptible. The kind of change you only notice if you've spent years learning to read a particular person. "Daniel," he said. "He found the structure 14 months ago. He was going to come to you with it." Adrian looked at the lockbox. He looked at Elena's face. He looked at the 12 armed men from the Marlowe plane, visible at the far end of the apron, still and watchful. "You stayed," he said. "You stayed in the marriage." "Daniel?" "Why, it came out rough. Not an accusation. A fracture." Elena looked at him steadily. "Because someone had to," she said, "and because she stopped. Restarted. It doesn't matter right now. What matters is that Caleb knows I have this, and he knows you're here, and he has approximately." She checked her watch. 3 hours before Priya finishes pulling the financial records, and you have everything you need without my help. Adrian stared at her. "You know about Priya. I know you. You didn't come here without making a call first." Something in his face shifted, then not softened. Exactly. But opened. The way a room opens when someone finally turns on the right light. He reached out. He took the lockbox from her hand. And then his phone rang. It was Caleb. Adrian looked at the screen. Elena watched him look at it. "He knows you're here," she said quietly. Adrian answered. "Caleb," he said. Caleb's voice on the line was careful and controlled, and underneath both of those things was something that sounded, for the first time in 15 years, like urgency that wasn't quite fear, but was standing right next to it. "I think Elena has compromised your meeting with the airfield contact," Caleb said. "I think she's playing you, Adrian. I think she brought you out there to mine us if—" "Where are you right now?" Adrian asked. A pause. I'm at the operations center. Which one? Another pause. Longer, the Midtown office. Adrian looked at Elena. Elena shook her head. Caleb, Adrian said. Priya's pulling the subsidiary records right now. All of them. 2 years' worth. He kept his voice completely neutral. If there's anything in there I should know about, before she finds it, now is the time. The line went silent. Not the silence of a man thinking. The silence of a man realizing, I'll explain everything in person, Caleb said. Don't let Elena. Adrian hung up. He stood on the wet runway with the lockbox in one hand and his phone in the other, and he looked at Elena, and Elena looked at him, and overhead the sky was beginning its slow, imperceptible shift from black to the deep bruised blue that comes just before the dark gives up. He's not at the Midtown office, Elena said. No. Adrian pocketed his phone. He's not. From somewhere beyond the far fence line of the airfield, the sound of vehicles came distant, moving fast, not on the main road. The 12 Marlowe men at the far end of the apron had already turned to face the sound. Garrett was out of the car. Adrian looked at Elena one more time, and what was in his face in that moment was complicated and unfinished and would take a long time to become language. But for now, he said only what was necessary. Stay close to me. Elena picked up the suitcase. I've been doing that, she said, for 2 years. The vehicles were getting louder. The sky above the runway was still dark, but barely. And somewhere in the pre-dawn dark, Caleb Rourke had just run out of time to control the story. The vehicles came through the eastern fence line. Not through the gate, through the fence itself, 2 of them. Heavy black SUVs, moving at the kind of speed that means whoever is driving has already decided that stopping is not part of the plan. The chain link buckled and shrieked and folded under the first bumper, and then both vehicles were on the apron. Headlights cutting hard across the wet tarmac, and the 12 Marlowe men had already spread a line without anyone giving an order. Adrian grabbed Elena's arm, not hard fast. Behind me, he said. I'm not Elena. His voice dropped to something that wasn't a request. She moved behind him, not because she was afraid she'd stopped being afraid of the physical versions of a long time ago, but because she understood geometry. 2 vehicles, 12 men on her side, Adrian between her and the headlights, and somewhere in the dark beyond the fence line, there were almost certainly more. Garrett was already at Adrian's left shoulder, with his weapon drawn. The SUVs stopped 30 yards out, engines running, high beams on. Nobody got out for a moment, that specific, calculated pause that is designed to let the light do its work, to make the people standing in it feel exposed and counted and small. Then the passenger door of the first vehicle opened. The man who stepped out was not one of Caleb's regular security detail. Elena clocked that immediately wrong build, wrong posture, the way he held his arms slightly away from his body, advertising that he was armed and not concerned about you, knowing it. He was broad through the chest, dark jacket, no visible rank or affiliation, and he walked to the midpoint between the 2 vehicles and stop. Mr. Voss, he called. His voice was flat and accented Eastern European, Elena thought, or trained to sound like it. Mr. Rourke sends his apologies for the hour. Adrian said nothing. He's asking you to step away from the woman and come with us. Just a conversation. He says you'll understand the context once he explains. Tell Rourke he can explain it on the phone, Adrian said. He prefers in person. I'm sure he does. The man glanced back at the vehicles. Something passed between him and whoever was still inside, a look, a signal, something too small to read at 30 yards. Then he looked back at Adrian. The woman needs to come too, he said. Mr. Rourke's been very specific about that. No, Adrian said. The man tilted his head slightly. I know it wasn't a question. Adrian's voice had gone completely flat, not angry. Flatter than angry, which is always more dangerous. Go back to your vehicle. Tell Caleb I'll talk to him when I'm ready to talk to him. And tell him that whatever he thinks he's controlling right now, he's not. The man stood there for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to the SUV and got in, and the vehicles sat there with their engines running and their lights on. Garrett leaned close to Adrian's ear. They're not leaving. No. Adrian glanced at the Marlowe men, who had held their line without moving. How many does your team have? 12 here. 8 more at the perimeter gate. The vehicles that came through the fence, that's 6. maybe 8 men between them. Caleb sent a message, not a force. Adrian's eyes were on the headlights. He wants me uncertain. He wants me standing here calculating instead of moving. Elena was already calculating. She pulled the lockbox from her coat. Adrian felt her move and looked back at her. "The financial records," she said quietly. "I have the digital copies on an encrypted drive inside this. But the primary evidence, the complete documentation that names the Santoro intermediary and connects the Malta accounts, that's in a secondary deposit. Not here." Adrian looked at her. "Where?" "A safety deposit box. Manhattan Fidelity on 48th. The key is on the chain." She touched the neckline of her coat. "If Caleb gets me before I get to that box, the primary evidence is gone. He probably already knows about the drive. He doesn't know about the box. How long has he known about the drive? Since yesterday, probably. I had to move it twice. He has someone watching my communication channels. I flagged a trace on my secondary device 3 days ago." She held his gaze. "He came here for the drive, Adrian. The conversation is theater." Adrian looked at the headlights. He looked at Elena. He said, very quietly, "You should have told me about Daniel." Elena looked back at him with an expression that was not apology and not defiance, but something in between the face of someone who made a terrible choice for reasons that still seem correct, even in retrospect, and who has learned to live with the weight of that without needing it explained. "You weren't ready to hear it," she said, "and I didn't have enough yet to make it stick. That wasn't your decision to make." "No." She didn't look away. "It wasn't. I made it anyway." Adrian absorbed that. His jaw moved once. Then he turned back to the runway. "Garrett," he said, "get her to the gate. My vehicle, not yours. Keys are in the ignition." He reached into his coat pocket and put something in Elena's hand, a phone. Not his primary, the secondary. Priya's number is the first one in the recents. "Call her when you're moving. Tell her to lock the subsidiary records to a read-only archive before Caleb can delete anything." "And you?" Elena said. "I'm going to stand here and make sure those vehicles don't follow you." "Adrian, Elena." He looked at her then, full on, and whatever was happening behind his face was not the cold operational calculation she was used to seeing from him. It was something rawer than that, something she recognized and had not let herself name in 2 years. "Go." She went. The gray SUV cleared the main gate with Garrett driving, and Elena in the passenger seat with the secondary phone already to her ear. And Priya picked up on the first ring, because Priya had apparently been awake since Adrian's call and was running on coffee and the particular sharpened alertness of someone doing something no matters. "Lock the subsidiary records," Elena said. "Read-only archive right now, before Caleb's credentials can touch them." Pause. "Who is this, Elena Voss?" "Adrian authorized this call." "Lock the records, Priya." A longer pause. Elena could hear keystrokes. "Done," Priya said. "Locked and time-stamped at 4:23 a. His credentials are suspended from those files." Another pause. "Ms. Voss, the records I've been pulling. I'm only 20 minutes into the review, and there's already. I know what's in them. There's a transfer structure that goes back further than 2 years," Ritzia said. "Significantly further. There are accounts that—" She stopped. "I need to say this carefully. There are accounts that predate Mr. Voss's leadership, that predate even Mr. Rourke's tenure as head of security." Elena was quiet for a moment. "How far back?" she said. 19 years, Priya said. "The origin account in the Malta structure was opened 19 years ago. The signatory on the account at opening." A pause that felt long and careful. The signatory was a man named Thomas Voss. The car moved through the pre-dawn streets, and Elena sat with that name settling into the existing architecture of everything she thought she already knew, and it changed the shape of things in ways she was not entirely prepared for at 4:23 in the morning. Adrian's father, Thomas Voss, had been dead for 11 years. He had, according to every version of the story Elena had ever been told, built the organization from nothing, and left it to Adrian in a state of controlled, functioning power. He had, according to the same versions, been a man of ruthless but contained principle, brutal when necessary, loyal to the people who were loyal to him. He had also, apparently, built an offshore financial structure with a Santoro-linked Malta account 19 years ago, which meant the Santoro connection wasn't Caleb's invention, Thomas Voss's. And Caleb hadn't built the betrayal. He'd inherited it. He'd maintained it. He'd grown it. He had, at some point in the past decade, made the calculation that it was more valuable to operate the structure for himself than to report it. Elena pressed her thumb against the top of the lockbox. "Priya," she said, "does the Malta account show any early transactions to a Marlowe family entity?" The silence this time was different, pointed. "Yes," Priya said. 14 transactions over a period of 4 years. The receiving account is registered to a Marlowe Holdings subsidiary that was dissolved in Miss Voss. This was dissolved the same year your brother was born. Elena closed her eyes. The thing she had built her entire understanding of this situation on the idea that Thomas Voss had been manipulated by the Santoros, that Caleb had corrupted a clean inheritance, was not wrong, just incomplete. Thomas Voss and her own family had built this thing together before Thomas had turned on the Marlowes and cut the account, before the feud had started, before both families had spent 16 years bleeding each other without knowing they'd both been built on the same rotten foundation. "Don't share this with anyone else yet," Elena said. "Not even Adrian. Not until I talk to him first, understood?" She hung up. Garrett glanced at her. He'd heard enough to read the silence. "How bad?" Complicated, Elena said. "On a scale. It means this was never just Caleb." She watched the city move past the windows. Streets were quieter now, that specific 4 a.m. stillness where the night shift hasn't ended and the morning hasn't started. "It means Adrian's father started this, and my family was involved before the break. Before the feud." She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass. "Everything Caleb has been running, he didn't build a corruption. He inherited one and decided to keep it for himself." Garrett drove for a moment without speaking. "Does that change what you do with the evidence?" he said. "No." She said it immediately. "The evidence exposes Caleb. What it does to the rest of it, to the history, to what Thomas Voss was, that's Adrian's to deal with. But not tonight. And when I tell him, he's going to have to decide who he is separately from who his father was." She sat back. "It's not going to be easy." "No," Garrett said. "It's not." They drove. Back at the airfield, Caleb's vehicles had not moved. Adrian stood on the tarmac in the runway lights and watched them, and the Marlowe men held their position behind him, and nobody did anything for 4 minutes that felt much longer than 4 minutes. Then the first SUV's engine changed pitch, not turning off, just shifting, like something was being decided inside it, and Adrian's phone buzzed against his hip. "Not the secondary. The primary, Caleb," Adrian answered. "You're wasting time." "I want to talk to you without an audience," Caleb said. His voice was different now from what it had been 20 minutes ago on the previous call. "Dear," more settled, which was not reassuring. Caleb's voice got steadier when he had decided to stop negotiating. "Come to the vehicle, just you. 5 minutes. And if I don't, then I release what I have on Elena to every faction head in your organization. Before the sun comes up," Caleb said. "And I mean what I actually have, Adrian. Not the surveillance image. Something considerably more significant." Adrian said nothing. "She's been in contact with Marcus Santoro directly," Caleb said. "Not through intermediaries. I have recorded audio. 7 calls over the past 4 months. I have transcripts." A pause. "I know how it looks from where you're standing. I know what she told you tonight. But she's been playing the sides of this, and the recorded calls will show you exactly how." The wind moved across the tarmac, and Adrian stood in it and thought about the metadata on the surveillance image. He thought up Priya's locked records. He thought about Elena on this same runway 20 minutes ago, holding out the lockbox, telling him about Daniel without flinching. He thought about 7 calls to Marcus Santoro over 4 months. "Send me the transcripts," Adrian said, in person. "Send them now or they don't mean anything." A pause. Then his phone buzzed a file notification. He pulled the phone from his ear and looked at the screen. A document file, 3 pages, time-stamped. He opened it. Transcript format was clean. Phone numbers at the top. One of them was a number he recognized as Elena's secondary device. The other was a Santoro-registered line, confirmed by his own intelligence database 6 months ago. Calls were dated across the past 4 months. The content of the transcripts was operational, specific. References to account access points, to personnel vulnerabilities inside Adrian's organization, to timing windows. Adrian read 2 pages of it. He stood very still. Then he noticed something. The secondary device number at the top of the transcript, the one attributed to Elena, had an area code he recognized. He recognized it because he'd assigned that device himself. He'd given Elena that secondary phone 13 months ago for internal communication. The calls in the transcript were dated from the past 4 months. 13 months ago was when he'd assigned the number. The area code prefix on the transcript number was from a carrier batch that his company had purchased and registered. He knew this because he'd signed the carrier contract himself 8 months ago. Phone number that existed 8 months ago could not have been used to make calls 13 months ago. The number in the transcript was real. The timestamped attribution was not. Adrian closed the file. He put the phone back to his ear. "Caleb," he said, "you've read it. The carrier registration date on that number is 8 months old," Adrian said. "Calls are attributed to 13 months ago." He kept his voice level and clean. "You want to try again?" The line was quiet. Then Caleb said, "Come to the vehicle, Adrian." And something in the way he said it, the absolute quiet of it, the absence of any further argument, made Adrian understand that the conversation had just changed shape, that Caleb had moved past persuasion. "If you don't come to this vehicle," Caleb said, "I'm going to make a call. And when I make that call, the men I have at the Manhattan Fidelity Building on 48th Street are going to go inside." Adrian went very still. "Elena needs a key to open what's in there," Caleb continued. "I know about the box. I've known about it for 6 days. I didn't move on it because I was trying to resolve this without—" He stopped, recalibrated. "I'm not your enemy, Adrian. I'm trying to give you a way out of this that doesn't end your organization. Taking my wife, by removing the variable that has been actively working against you since before you knew she existed." Caleb's voice was patient now, the patience of a man who believes he is explaining something obvious to someone who is almost ready to understand it. "I have loved this organization. I have bled for this organization. Everything I've done, every accommodation, every structural adjustment has been to protect what we built." "What we built," Adrian said. "Yes. My father built this. I built what came after." He paused. "You maintained it. There's a difference, Caleb." The line went quiet again. "Come to the vehicle," Caleb said. "For the last time." And they both knew it was the last time. Adrian looked at the 2 SUVs sitting in their own headlight wash 30 yards away. He looked at the Marlowe men behind him. He thought about Elena in the gray SUV, moving through the city toward a safety deposit box that Caleb apparently knew about and had men outside. He thought about all the ways this could end. Then he walked toward the vehicle. The inside of the SUV smelled of leather and cold coffee and the specific tension of a space where everyone in it is armed and nobody has decided yet whether to use it. Caleb sat in the back seat, not the way a man sits when he's been waiting, but the way a man sits when he's been running something and is pausing briefly to redirect it. He was in his late 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of physical stillness that comes from decades of discipline and reads at a glance. It's calm, but is actually something more like compression. He had a tablet in his hand. Adrian got in and pulled the door shut. No one else in the back seat. The driver and one other man in the front, both facing forward. "Where's Elena?" Adrian said. "Approximately 12 minutes from the Fidelity Building," Caleb said. "My men are instructed to wait until she arrives. I wanted to have this conversation first." "What conversation?" Caleb turned the tablet to face him. On the screen was a photograph, not a surveillance image, this time. A document photograph. An original document, the kind that's been handled and folded and aged. Adrian looked at it, and his eyes moved across the text, and then stopped at a name near the bottom. Thomas Voss. And next to it, a second signature, a Marlowe family signature. "Your father and Elena's grandfather built the original offshore structure together," Caleb said. 19 years ago, before the feud, before the split. He set the tablet down. "I've had this for 9 years. Thomas gave it to me before he died and told me to keep it safe. Told me it was insurance, that if the Marlowe family ever tried to move against the organization, this document proved their family had built the same network. It made them equally culpable." Adrian looked at the document. "He also told me," Caleb said, "that if you ever found out, it would destroy you. That knowing your father had done this, would his words break the only thing left in you worth saving." He paused. I have been protecting you from this for 9 years, Adrian. Everything I've done has been trying to keep this from becoming the thing that ends you. The car was quiet. Outside, the first gray edge of morning was beginning to show above the eastern tree line. You believe that, Adrian said. Not a question. Yes. You believe that taking money from the Santoros, killing Daniel Marlowe, forging evidence against my wife, and sending armed men to a safety deposit box is you protecting me. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Daniel found the document. If he'd brought it to you, you had him killed. Adrian's voice did not rise. It went down, into something so controlled it was almost inaudible. You had my wife's brother killed to protect a secret that you've been using to leverage an independent financial operation for 9 years. It wasn't don't. Adrian looked at him directly. For the first time since getting in the vehicle, full eye contact, and what was in Adrian's face was not rage. Rage is loud. This was the thing that comes before you decide to be done with something permanently. Don't tell me what it was. Caleb held his gaze. Call your men off the Fidelity building, Adrian said. Adrian, call them off, Caleb. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone, and he didn't call his men off. He called someone else entirely. Bring her in, he said into the phone. Adrian moved. Faster than Caleb had anticipated, which was the mistake Caleb had made in designing this conversation. He'd accounted for Adrian's reason, and had not accounted for what was underneath it. Adrian had the phone out of Caleb's hand before the call fully connected, and then the 2 men in the front seat had turned, and Adrian was already at the door, and the door wouldn't open from the inside. He'd known that was possible. He hit the window instead. The safety glass cracked on the second blow and broke inward on the third, and Adrian went through the gap with a cut along his forearm and hit the tarmac on one knee and was up in 2 seconds, the cold air hitting him full in the face. And the Marlowe men were already moving because they'd been watching the vehicle the entire time. Behind him, the SUV door opened. Caleb stepped out. He didn't chase Adrian. He stood by the vehicle and watched Adrian walk toward the Marlowe line, and he had his phone to his ear again, and he said 3 words that carried clearly across the tarmac in the morning cold. Take her now. Adrian stopped walking. He turned. Caleb looked at him across 30 yards of wet runway and said nothing else. He didn't need to. The calculation was clear, and both of them knew it. Adrian could stand here and manage the airfield situation, or he could get back in a vehicle and try to reach Elena before Caleb's men reached her first. Couldn't do both. Garrett picked up on the first ring. They're moving on her, Adrian said. Get to the Fidelity building. Now, don't let them. He heard it over the phone before Garrett said anything. Glass. Then a short, sharp sound. Then nothing. Then Garrett's voice, strained and compressed. We've got a problem. Adrian was already running for the remaining vehicle at the perimeter gate. The sun was beginning to come up over the eastern edge of the city, gray and cold and indifferent, and somewhere in it, Elena Marlowe was either already running or already caught, and the key around her neck opened the only box that could end this. And Caleb had just burned through every version of the conversation that didn't involve force. There was no more talking now. There was only what came next. The phone was still in Adrian's hand when he hit the gate. Garrett had gone silent after those 2 words, "We've got a problem," and the line hadn't dropped. It was still open. Adrian could hear ambient sound through it. Wind, a car engine, something scraping against pavement, and then a voice he didn't recognize, saying something short and flat, in a language that wasn't English, and then nothing again. Not silence. The specific quality of a line being covered by a hand. Adrian got into the perimeter vehicle, a black Tahoe, keys already in, and had it moving before the door was fully closed. Garrett's last known position was 12 minutes from the Fidelity building, which meant if Caleb's men had moved the moment Caleb made the call, they had a 3-minute head start minimum. Called Priya while driving. The Fidelity building on 48th, he said. I need any camera access on the block. Street level, ATM. Building lobby, anything you can pull without a warrant in the next 4 minutes. I'm on it. Keystrokes. Adrian, the subsidiary records. I've been going deeper into the Malta structure, and there's something you need to minus after, he said. It's about your father. He drove through a red light on 11th Avenue and said nothing. Later, he said, and she understood the register of it and went quiet and pulled the cameras instead. The city at 4:40 in the morning was not empty, but it was thin delivery trucks, a few cabs, the particular population of people who are out at this hour because they work nights or because something has gone wrong. Adrian drove fast and kept his eyes on the road and kept the open line to Garrett's phone pressed to his ear and listened to the ambient sound of wherever Garrett was and tried to map it. The scraping sound came again. Then Garrett's voice, tight and controlled, close to the phone. "I'm in the car." They took her at the light on 47th. 4 men, 2 vehicles. She got out of the car before they could pull her out. She was already moving when they hit us. She ran east on foot. A breath. I lost visual. My front window is gone and I've got a situation with my left arm. How bad? It'll keep. She was running toward the building, Adrian. She knew where she was going. Can you drive? Barely. Get to 48th and hold the block. Don't go in. Adrian ended that call and kept Priya's open. Talk to me. I've got the ATM camera on the northeast corner of 48th and Madison, Priya said. There's activity. I can see 2 men outside the Fidelity building entrance. They're not going in yet. They're waiting. They're waiting for her to come to them, Adrian said. She's on foot and they know where she's headed. She knows they're waiting. Does she know you? No. Adrian thought about Elena on the runway an hour ago, the lockbox in her hand, telling him about the key around her neck with the specific calm of someone who has already run every version of this scenario and accepted the ones she can't control. He thought about 2 years of her doing things he hadn't seen, protecting something he hadn't known, needed protecting staying in a marriage that had been used against her by the man he'd trusted most. She's already figured out another way in, he said. Get me the building's service entrance. Elena had figured out another way in 48 hours ago. Not because she'd anticipated tonight. Specifically, she'd anticipated something like tonight in a general shape that she'd been preparing for since the moment she'd realized Caleb had a trace on her secondary device. The Fidelity building had 3 points of entry, the main lobby on 48th, the parking access on 47th, and a service corridor that connected through the adjacent building's basement via a shared utility easement that had never been updated in the public building records because the renovation that had created it had been permitted under a different address. She knew about the easement because Daniel had told her. Daniel, who had done his research thoroughly and carefully and had died for it anyway, had walked her through the building's access points over the phone 14 months ago when he'd first told her about the Malta account. He'd been thinking ahead to exactly this kind of problem. He'd always thought that way 3 moves out, contingency inside. Contingency, the same way their fathers had thought before the feud had made their father bitter and reactive and slow. Elena moved through the 47th Street parking structure with her coat pulled close and the lockbox inside it and the key still on its chain against her sternum. Her left knee had taken the impact when she'd hit the pavement rolling out of Garrett's car. She'd felt that the joint compressed wrong, and now it was stiffening in the cold, and she was not running so much as moving with aggressive purpose at a pace that kept the stiffness from locking up completely. The service corridor entrance was a gray metal door behind a dumpster bay on the parking structure's basement level. It required a code that Daniel had given her. She punched it in. The door opened. She went through. The corridor was narrow, lit by fluorescent strips, smelling of old concrete and pipe insulation. It ran approximately 60 feet before connecting to a stairwell that came up inside the adjacent building's utility level. From there, a second corridor ran east and connected through a door that required only a standard fire access key, which her building management contact had given her 3 weeks ago. In exchange for conversation, she hoped she'd never need to have to the Fidelity building's basement level, 2 floors below the public lobby. She moved through all of it without stopping. Her knee protested on the stairs. She ignored it. The safety deposit room was on the basement level, accessible from an internal elevator, or from the stairwell she came out of. At 4:45 in the morning, there was no staff at the basement desk. The Fidelity building ran a skeleton overnight, with a single security officer in the main lobby and nobody below until 7 a.m. Elena went to box 1147. She put the key in. She opened it. Inside was a single sealed envelope, letter-sized, thick with documents, and a USB drive taped to the inside of the envelope's back. She took both. She put the envelope inside her coat next to the lockbox. She took the USB drive and held it for a moment, just a moment, looking at it in the fluorescent basement light, thinking about Daniel sitting at a desk somewhere 14 months ago, assembling this with the careful, thorough patience of someone who wanted to make sure it was enough. It was enough. She closed the box. She turned to go. A man was standing at the stairwell door. Not one of Caleb's men. She'd have recognized Caleb's people. She'd been cataloging them for 2 years. This man was different. Younger, mid-30s, in a coat that was slightly too good for a building maintenance worker and slightly too casual for a lawyer. He was standing with his hands visible, which was deliberate, and he was looking at her with an expression that was careful and not quite neutral. "Ms. Marlowe," he said. She had the lockbox in her hand and 3 feet of open space between her and the door to the utility corridor. "Who are you?" she said. "My name is Vincent Caruso," he said. "I work for Marcus Santoro." The fluorescent light hummed. Elena did not move. "Mr. Santoro would like to speak with you," Caruso said. "Before you leave this building with whatever's in that envelope. How did you get in here?" "The same way you did." He paused. "We've known about the easement for 6 months. We've been watching you for 6 months, Ms. Marlowe. Not to stop you, to wait." "Wait for what?" "For you to get far enough along that stopping you didn't make sense anymore." He took 1 step forward, just one, and then stopped when she shifted her weight. "Mr. Santoro isn't Caleb Rourke's ally. He never was. The Malta structure your brother found, the Santoro connection. In those records, I need you to understand what you're actually looking at before you use that material." Elena looked at him. Her knee was throbbing. The envelope was against her ribs. "Talk fast," she said. "The Malta account was built by Thomas Voss and your grandfather together," Caruso said. "When Thomas turned on the Marlowe family and the feud started, he tried to fold the Santoro connection in as a secondary leverage point. He made it look, in the records, like the Santoros had been the architects of the corruption, like your family had been dealing with them." He paused. "They hadn't. My family has been trying to get those records corrected for 9 years. If you release the raw documentation without context, it implicates the Santoro organization in a structure we didn't build and a feud we didn't start." Elena's eyes were moving constantly, the door behind him, the door to the corridor. The camera in the corner of the ceiling that she'd confirmed was on a 4-hour loop when she'd done her reconnaissance. "Why should I believe you?" she said. "Because if we wanted to stop you, we would have taken the box 6 months ago." Caruso reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, one hand only, and produced a folded document. He held it out toward her without moving forward. "This is the original incorporation document for the Malta Holding Company. The one Thomas Voss had altered to add the Santoro signatory block. The unaltered version, with only Thomas Voss's name and your grandfather's." He let her look at it from where she was standing. "We've had this since Thomas died. My father kept it because he knew someday someone would find the account, and he wanted to be ready to prove what it actually was." Elena looked at the document from 4 feet away. Even at that distance, she could see enough of the format to understand it was original, the paper type, the typeface, the notarial stamp in the bottom right corner. "If you had this," she said carefully, "why not go to Adrian directly?" "Because Adrian Voss spent 4 years systematically dismantling our organization," Caruso said, with a flatness that was not accusation but simply fact. "We weren't going to walk into his offices with exculpatory evidence for a man who was trying to destroy us." He paused. "But you're different. You're not trying to destroy anyone. You're trying to stop the right people from destroying each other." Elena stood in the fluorescent basement and breathed. She thought about the call records in the lockbox, the ones connecting Caleb to Daniel's death. She thought about what Priya had found, Thomas Voss's signature on the Malta account, and the Marlowe family receiving account, and the way the whole structure had been built in layers, so that if anyone ever found it, the story it told could be arranged differently depending on which documents you had and which you didn't. She thought about Caleb, who had inherited the structure and maintained it and expanded it and used it as his own private financial engine while simultaneously weaponizing its existence against everyone who got close enough to find it. She thought about Adrian on the runway, taking the lockbox from her hand. I need 5 minutes, she said. I'll wait, Caruso said. She opened the envelope. Inside were Daniel's documents, the financial transfer records, the Malta account statements, the communication logs between Caleb and the intermediary contact. She spread them on the surface of the nearest deposit counter and laid the original incorporation document and the Caruso had given her alongside them, and she looked at the complete picture. With the Santoro incorporation document, the story the evidence told was clean. Thomas Voss had built the original structure with the Marlowe family, had turned on them, had altered the Malta records to falsely implicate the Santoros as a secondary insurance policy, and had left Caleb as the custodian of a poisoned inheritance that Caleb had ultimately chosen to operate for his own benefit. Daniel had found it. Caleb had silenced Daniel. Caleb had then spent the past year trying to frame Elena for the corruption he was running, because Elena had gotten close enough that he needed a story ready when the structure finally came apart. Clean. It was complete, and it was devastating. She repacked everything into the envelope. She added the incorporation document. She looked at Caruso. Who else knows you're here? She said. 2 men outside the building. They're holding Caleb's people on the street, not with force, just presence. Enough to buy you time. He paused. Mr. Santoro wants one thing in exchange for that document. I've been waiting for it. What? She said. When this is over, when the Malta structure is exposed and the people responsible for it are dealt with, the Santoro organization is left alone. No further dismantling. Whatever Adrian Voss decides to do with his legitimate business, my family's remaining interests are not the next target. He looked at her steadily. We're already smaller than we were. We can go legitimate in 18 months if we're not being hunted while we do it. Elena looked at him for a long time. I can't make that promise for Adrian, she said. No, Caruso said. But you can make it for yourself. And from what we've observed over the past 6 months, you're the one who's been running this anyway. She held his gaze. Then she put the envelope back inside her coat. Tell Mr. Santoro I heard him, she said. She went through the corridor door. She came out of the parking structure on 47th. She came out at the curbside and then engine with the engine running, and Adrian behind the wheel with a cut on his forearm that had bled through his sleeve, and he looked at her coming through the exit door with the specific expression of someone who has been operating on high alert for so long that relief and anger arrive simultaneously, and neither one wins. She got in. He pulled into traffic before she had the door fully closed. The envelope, he said. I have it. Caleb's men? Held on the street. Someone else's people. He glanced at her. Santoro, she said. Adrian's jaw tightened. He drove. Explain, she explained. All of it, Caruso. The incorporation document, the false signatory block, what Thomas Voss had done to the original records. She said it straight through without softening any part of it, watching his face in her peripheral vision as she talked. His expression did not break open the way she'd half expected. It did something worse. It went very still, the way a building goes, still right before structural failure. Everything holding its original shape for one more second before the weight becomes too much. When she finished, he drove in silence for almost a full minute. My father built this, he said. Not a question. Yes, he built it with your family. Then he destroyed your family. Then he left Caleb sitting on top of it. Yes. And Caleb kept it running, kept the Santoro framing in place, used it to fund a parallel operation. He stopped at a light. His hands on the wheel were completely still, and when Daniel found it, Caleb had him killed to protect it. Yes, the light changed. He drove. You've known all of this, he said. Not all of it. Not the Santoro piece. I thought the Santoro connection was real until Priya found the account timestamps tonight. The rest, the basic structure, the transfers, Caleb's operation. I've known the shape of it for 14 months. You stayed, Adrian. You stayed in this marriage for 14 months knowing my father built the thing that got your brother killed. She turned to look at him directly. I stayed because exposing it halfway would have gotten you killed too. Caleb would have moved against you the moment he thought you were going to find out. I needed all of it before I could give you any of it. Adrian drove. His face said nothing for a while. Then, you should have told me about Daniel. I know. I know what you would have done, she said. You would have gone at Caleb immediately. with whatever you had, which wasn't enough. She held his gaze, even though he was watching the road. You would have moved too fast, and Caleb would have had you. He's been inside your organization for 15 years, Adrian. He had contingencies for every version of you coming at him angry. He didn't have a contingency for me. Adrian said nothing. Outside the windows, the city was beginning to show its first actual daylight, thin, gray, the kind of early morning light that makes everything look tired and provisional. They drove east without a destination, and the silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was different from most of the silences they'd had in 2 years of marriage. His phone buzzed. Priya, he answered on speaker. I need to say something, and I need you both to hear it, Priya said, which meant she'd already understood from the last call that Elena was present. I've finished the preliminary review on the subsidiary records, the Malta structure, the transfers, the Caleb Santoro communication logs. I have it all locked and documented. A pause. But I found something else. Something that wasn't in the financial records. What? Adrian said. When I locked Caleb's credentials, it triggered an automatic flag on a secondary account he'd been accessing separately. Not part of the Malta structure, separate. Personal. Another pause. There are payments going back 9 years to an individual listed in the account as a consulting retainer. Monthly. Significant amounts. She paused a third time, and the pause had weight. The individual's name is Victor Harland. He is currently the senior partner of the law firm that drafted your divorce papers. Carr was quiet. Elena heard it before she processed it. Adrian heard it and looked at the road, and his hands tightened on the wheel by a degree. The divorce papers, Elena said slowly. I had the firm pull the original filing record while I had the account open, Priya said. Papers were drafted 3 months ago, not the standard timeline for a filing of this type. And the instructions given to the firm. She stopped. The instructions came from Caleb's account, not from Adrian's. Elena turned to look at Adrian. Adrian was looking at the road. Filed the divorce, Elena said. Not a question. Not loud. Just the words finding their shape in the air. He drafted the papers and sent them through your account credentials, Priya said. Your authorization signature on the instruction letter is a digital forgery. The metadata timestamps are inconsistent with your device's usage log for that date. You were in Chicago for the Brennan meeting. Your device pinged a Chicago cell tower all day. A pause. You never authorized the divorce, Adrian. The car stopped at a red light. Adrian sat at the wheel and looked at the light and did not move. Elena watched his face. The divorce, the thing that had started all of this. The document that had put Elena on a curb at 2 a.m. with $11 and a dead phone, the thing that had allowed Caleb to move his timeline up and force the confrontation. Before Elena was ready, had never been Adrian's decision. Caleb had done it. Caleb had forged Adrian's authorization and filed the papers through a law firm he'd been paying for 9 years and had accelerated the entire sequence because he'd known Elena was close to having everything she needed, and he'd calculated that putting her on the street with nothing was the fastest way to flush her out before she was ready. And Adrian, who had stood at a penthouse window watching his wife in the rain at 2 a.m. and had not known why he couldn't sign the papers himself, had not authorized any of it. Adrian, Elena said. He didn't look at her immediately. When he did, his face had done something she'd never seen it do. In 2 years of proximity, it had lost its architecture. Not broken, not collapsed. But the thing he used to maintain control of his own expression had simply stopped operating, and what was underneath was complicated and unguarded and exhausted. Priya, he said. Where is Caleb right now? His phone last pinged a cell tower in Red Hook, Priya said. 40 minutes ago. There's a Voss-owned coastal facility down there. A shipping terminal on the waterfront that's been inactive for 3 years. Get me the address. Priya gave it. Adrian looked at Elena. Evidence, he said. Everything in that envelope. Yes. If I send it to every faction head in my organization right now before I go to Red Hook, Caleb loses his operational support. His men start getting calls. They start calculating. He held her gaze. How fast can that happen? Elena opened the envelope. She looked at what was inside. She thought about Caruso's people on the street and the Marlowe men at the airfield. And Priya locked in a server room, somewhere running records that were already archived and protected. I have contact information for 6 of your 7 major faction heads, she said. I've had it for 8 months. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Of course you do, he said. Something passed across her face, not quite a smile, not quite apology. The expression of someone who has been playing a long and painful game and is finally at nearly 5 a.m. in a car going east through a gray morning, close enough to the end of it to feel the edge. Send it, he said. She sent it. And then his phone rang, not Priya, not Garrett, not any number he recognized, and when he answered it, the voice on the other end was Caleb's. And Caleb sounded, for the first time in this entire night, like a man who has stopped calculating and started burning. You want to know where I am, Caleb said. Come find out. A second voice came through the line, then brief, caught mid-breath, cut off fast. Elena's face went very still. It was a woman's voice. It was Priya. Caleb had Priya, and the address in Red Hook that Priya had just given Adrian the shipping terminal, the location Caleb had apparently allowed to be revealed, was not a place Caleb had retreated to. It was a place Caleb had chosen. It was a trap. And Adrian had already said he was going. He ended the call. He looked at the road. His hands on the wheel were not shaking, but the skin across his knuckles had gone pale, with how hard he was holding on. And Elena looked at his profile in the early morning light and understood that the man sitting next to her had just passed through the last moment where walking away was a calculation he was capable of making. You don't have to go alone, she said. I know, he said. Adrian, I know. He said again, and the way he said it told her that he understood the trap, understood that going was not rational, understood that Caleb had designed this specific moment for exactly the purpose of making Adrian stop thinking and start moving. He was going anyway, not because he'd stopped thinking, because some things you do not calculate. He turned the car south toward Red Hook, and the morning came up gray and cold over the water. And somewhere in a coastal shipping terminal, a man who had served beside him for 15 years was waiting, with a hostage and a plan, and nothing left to lose. And Adrian Voss drove toward it with the evidence that could end. Everything sitting in an envelope against his wife's ribs, and the knowledge that the man who had built his life, his father, Thomas Voss, had set the first stone of this particular ruin before Adrian was old enough to know what ruin looked like. He drove, and Elena sat beside him and did not tell him to stop. Because she had spent 2 years learning the exact shape of the things, Adrian Voss could not be talked out of. And this was the deepest one. And she understood it, and she reached across and put her hand over his on the wheel for one moment, just one before she took it back, and looked at the road ahead. Terminal was 40 minutes south. Priya was somewhere inside it, and Caleb was waiting. The Red Hook waterfront at 5 a.m. looked like the end of something. Not dramatically. Not the way the end of things looks in movies with fire and wreckage arranged for effect. It looked the way real endings look, gray and industrial and indifferent, the kind of place that has been useful and has stopped being useful, and has not yet been repurposed into anything else. The shipping terminal sat behind a chain-link perimeter topped with rusted razor wire, 3 warehouse structures connected by covered loading corridors. A dead crane arm extended over the water like a question nobody had answered. The East River moved behind it, dark and purposeful, not caring about any of this. Adrian parked 2 blocks out. He turned the engine off and sat for a moment. Elena was already looking at the terminal through the windshield, cataloging the visible entry points, counting what she could see of the light sources. 2 exterior floods on the nearest warehouse face. 1 moving beam that indicated a guard with a flashlight on the north perimeter. No visible heat or movement at the main gate. He wants you to walk in, she said. I know. He's positioned this so that the moment you're inside the perimeter, he controls all the variables. She kept her eyes on the building. Priya is the anchor. She's why you're here, and he knows it, which means she's leverage, not currency. He's not going to do anything to her until after he's done with you, because she's the only thing keeping you from going in with backup. I called Garrett on the way down, Adrian said. He's 7 minutes out. He's hurt. He's functional. Adrian looked at her. I need you to stay with the vehicle. No. Elena. No. She said it without heat, which made it more final than argument would have. I have the envelope. I have the USB from the deposit box. If something happens to you inside that building, and Caleb walks out with me sitting in the car, everything ends wrong. She held his gaze. I'm more useful inside than out. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. His forearm had stopped bleeding, but the sleeve was stiff with it, and he'd been awake, for he calculated brief 22 hours, and the cut stung every time he bent his arm, and none of that was the problem. The problem was a woman sitting in the passenger seat who had spent 2 years walking a line between protection and deception and had ended up on the right side of it, and who was now proposing to walk into a building that had been arranged specifically to kill the man she'd been protecting. There's a reason he didn't take the envelope at the building, Elena said. He had men outside Fidelity. He could have taken me on the street before Caruso's people moved. He didn't. He wanted me here. He wanted both of us here, together, so he could end it in one place. She reached into her coat and took out the USB drive, not the lockbox, the drive from Daniel's box, and held it up. This has everything in a format that can be transmitted in 40 seconds. If I can get to a network connection inside that building, I can push the entire file package to Priya's archive server and to the faction heads simultaneously. It doesn't need Priya. Physically, it just needs a signal. Adrian looked at the drive. The terminal has a network router in the operations room, he says. Old system. It was active when we used the facility. Where North Warehouse? Second floor rear. He paused. Caleb knows that building. He'll have people on the stairs. Then I don't use the stairs. She pocketed the drive. Give me 8 minutes inside before you go for Priya. 8 minutes, Adrian. He looked at her. What he wanted to say was something that would have taken longer than 8 minutes and required a different kind of night than this one to say properly. What he said instead was, if you're not at the operations room in 8 minutes, I'm not waiting. I know, she said. They got out of the car. The perimeter fence had a gap at the southeast corner where a section of posts had been pulled from the ground, not recently, years ago, and never repaired, kind of maintenance failure that accumulates in facilities that have stopped being prioritized. Elena knew about it because she'd had the terminal's maintenance records pulled 3 months ago. The same week, she'd pulled the Fidelity building's permit history because she had learned from her father that you study the ground before you stand on it. They went through the gap separately, 30 seconds apart. The gravel inside the perimeter was loose and wet and loud underfoot if you weren't careful. Elena moved along the fence line toward the North Warehouse, keeping the building's shadow between herself and the moving flashlight beam on the opposite side of the compound. Her knee had stiffened further in the cold and was now a specific, insistent pain with every step, not debilitating, but the kind of pain that demands a portion of your attention, whether you're willing to give it or not. She gave it nothing. Adrian moved toward the central corridor entrance, and she tracked him with peripheral vision until the angle of the building took him out of her sight line. And then she was alone in the fence and the warehouse wall, with the gravel under her feet, and the river smell coming off the water and the weight of the drive in her coat pocket. She found the North Warehouse's side entrance a personnel door, not the loading bay, and tested the handle. Unlocked, which meant Caleb wanted movement inside the building, which meant there were eyes on this door. She went in anyway. The ground floor of the North Warehouse was open storage, empty shelving units, old pallet stacks, the skeleton of a logistics operation that had been gutted years ago. The fluorescent strips overhead were off, but there was ambient light from the exterior floods coming through the high windows, enough to move by if you knew where you were going and kept your eyes adjusted. Elena kept low and moved along the right wall toward the far end, where the stairwell access was. She heard the man before she saw him, breathing slightly elevated, the breathing of someone who has been standing still for a while and is beginning to get cold. She stopped, pressed herself against a shelving unit, waited. He was positioned at the foot of the stairs. She could see the silhouette now standing, facing the stairwell door, weapon in a two-hand grip, professional posture, patient. He'd been told to watch the stairs, and he was watching them. He was not watching the shelving units along the right wall. Elena moved. She crossed the open between the shelving units and the stairwell door in a path that kept the last pallet stack between herself and the guard's sight line. and she was 8 feet from the door when her left knee decided to register its objection to the pace by sending a sharp, specific spike of pain up through her thigh, and she stumbled 1 step. A quarter second of disrupted motion, barely audible. The guard turned. She was already through the door. The stairwell was dark. She went up fast, the pain secondary to the momentum. 2 floors, the door at the top, opening into a narrow corridor that ran the length of the building's rear half. She could see the operations room from here. Glass-walled, dark inside, the shape of old computer equipment and a router bank visible through the glass. She went for it. Adrian walked through the central corridor entrance into the middle warehouse, and Caleb's voice came from somewhere above him, before he'd taken 10 steps. "I thought you'd bring more people." Adrian stopped. He looked up. The warehouse was tall, 20 feet of open air above the floor, a metal catwalk running the perimeter at the 15-foot level. Caleb was on the catwalk, visible now that Adrian's eyes had adjusted, standing at the rail with his hands resting on it, and his posture carrying the specific relaxation of a man who has arranged the room to his satisfaction. 2 men on the warehouse floor, Adrian had clocked them coming in, positioned at the corners. 2 more at the catwalk level, flanking Caleb, and Priya sitting on the floor against the far wall with her hands zip-tied in front of her and a cut above her eyebrow that had dried dark down the side of her face. She was conscious. Her eyes found Adrian's immediately. "Let her go," Adrian said. "She's not part of this. She's currently the most important part of this," Caleb said pleasantly. "She locked my credentials out of 23 subsidiary accounts and archived the financial records to a server I can't access without her cooperation. So until she undoes that, she's very much part of this." He paused. "Where's Elena?" Adrian said nothing. Caleb's expression shifted not much, but enough. "She's in the building." "She's in the car," Adrian said. "No, she's not." Caleb looked at the man on his left. The man spoke into a radio, listened, shook his head. Caleb looked back at Adrian. She came in the side entrance. Expected that. He stepped back from the catwalk rail. "Let me tell you what's going to happen, Adrian. Elena is going to find the operations room and she's going to try to use the network connection up there. But the router has been offline since 3 this morning. Whatever she has on that drive, she can't push it from inside this building." He paused, letting that settle. "So the only functional copy of the complete evidence is what she's carrying physically. And the only way out of this building is through me." Adrian looked at Priya. Priya looked back at him with an expression that was controlled and frightened, and underneath both of those things, working. She was thinking. He could see her thinking. She had been in a room with Caleb for 40 minutes, and she had been paying attention the way she always paid attention, cataloging and calculating, because that was what Priya did in every environment she was placed in, and it was why she was the best at what she did. "The archive is already locked," Adrian said. "You can take the physical evidence. You still can't access the financial records without her." "I don't need to access them," Caleb said. "I need to delete them, and the deletion command can be entered from any terminal with her admin credentials." He looked at Priya. "Which she's going to give me." "I'm not," Priya said. Her voice was tight but steady. "You will," Caleb said, with the patience of someone who has run interrogations before and knows that patience is the primary instrument. It's only a question of how long it takes. Adrian moved, not toward the stairs, toward the nearest of the 2 floor-level guards, who had not expected motion and took a half-second too long to respond, and in that half-second Adrian covered the distance and had the man's weapon arm and the weapon's trajectory controlled. And then it was close and ugly and fast, kind of physical engagement that has nothing in common with trained combat and everything in common with 2 people trying to establish physical dominance in a very small space, using whatever is immediately available. The gun went off. The round went into the floor. The noise in the enclosed warehouse was enormous, a flat concussive crack that bounced off the metal walls and hit everything twice, and in the ringing aftermath, Adrian had the weapon, and the guard was down on 1 knee with his arm at a wrong angle, and the second-floor level guard was already moving, and Adrian was already moving toward Priya, and from the catwalk, Caleb said something sharp to the men flanking him. Adrian reached Priya. He pulled her upright. She was zip-tied at the wrists, not the ankles, and she got her feet under her on the first try. The second guard was 8 feet away and closing. Garrett came through the loading bay door. He looked terrible pale, left arm held against his body, moving with the specific careful economy of someone in significant pain, but he was upright and he had a weapon. And the angle from the loading bay door covered the second-floor guard's approach, and the guard saw the angle and stopped. "Down," Garrett said. The guard went down. From the catwalk, Caleb looked at the changed geometry of the room with the expression of a man running a fast recalculation. 2 of his floor men neutralized. Priya standing, Garrett at the loading bay. The 2 catwalk men were still in position, but the catwalk didn't have a direct firing angle on Priya, without going through Adrian, and Adrian could read it in his posture, not ready to make that call yet. "Building is covered," Caleb said. "You've got 3 men with Garrett's entrance. You've got 2 on the east perimeter and 2 at the main gate. You walk out of here. You walk into them." "My people are 2 minutes out," Garrett said. "Your people are Marlowe family security, who have no standing to operate in this city," Caleb said. "You want to explain that to the NYPD response that's currently en route?" Someone called in a gunshot. The gunshot. Adrian looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at Adrian. The gunshot from 60 seconds ago had been inside a metal building in an industrial waterfront district at 5A. Police response to a reported shot in Red Hook was 4 to 6 minutes minimum. They had less time than Garrett's reinforcements needed. "Priya," Adrian said. "The deletion command. If Caleb enters it, he can't enter it without my biometric confirmation," Priya said quickly. "I set a secondary lock when I archived. It requires my thumbprint on a registered device. He can have my credentials, and it doesn't matter." She looked at Caleb as she said it. "You didn't know that." Caleb's expression confirmed that he hadn't. "Then this is simple," Adrian said, looking up at the catwalk. "You have nothing. The records are locked with biometric protection. The physical evidence is in this building somewhere, and in approximately 90 seconds you're going to have police and Marlowe security arriving simultaneously. Walk away, Caleb." "I'm not walking away," Caleb said. "There's nothing left. There's you." Caleb's voice had lost its management tone. What was underneath it was older and rawer and less controlled, and it came out now as in the specific way that things come out after a very long night, when a person has run out of the energy required to keep it below the surface. "There's 15 years. There is everything I built for you, and everything I protected for you, and every decision I made that kept this organization alive when you weren't capable of making those decisions yet." He gripped the catwalk rail. "Your father trusted me with this. Not you. Me. Because he knew what you were, he loved you. And he knew you didn't have the stomach for the real architecture of this thing. I maintained it. I kept it breathing. I kept it profitable. And then you married a woman who has spent 2 years trying to dismantle everything. I spent 15 years building. She's been trying to dismantle what you built, on top of what my father built wrong," Adrian said. The words came out flat and absolute, and I should have seen it sooner. That's on me. Caleb looked at him from the catwalk. Something moved through his face, not grief exactly, but related to it. The expression of a man who had built an identity around a version of events that has just been publicly named as false. "Come down," Adrian said. "It's done, Caleb." Caleb reached into his coat. He produced not a weapon but a phone. He held it up so Adrian could see the screen, a document displayed on it, dense with text, and Adrian's eyes found the key elements immediately. His own name, a signature block, a legal header, divorce proceedings. "These are the real papers," Caleb said. "Not the ones I had drafted. The originals. Your original authorization." He looked at Adrian steadily. "You did sign them." Not tonight, 4 months ago, when you told me you were thinking about ending the marriage, and I told you I'd handle the legal groundwork. You signed a document authorizing me to proceed with dissolution proceedings at my discretion. You don't remember it because it was 1 page in a 40-page operational authorization package I put in front of you after the Brennan meeting." He paused. "I used it. I accelerated the timeline because Elena was getting close. The authorization exists. Your signature is real." The warehouse was quiet. Adrian stood on the ground floor with Priya beside him, and Garrett at the loading bay door, and 2 men down, and 2 men on the catwalk, and Caleb held up a phone with a document on it, and the specific stillness that followed was the stillness of a fact landing in a room and changing the shape of the air. He had signed it. He didn't remember it. The Brennan meeting had been a 9-hour operational session, and he'd signed 30 or 40 documents over the course of it. Standard procedure, things Caleb had flagged as routine. He hadn't read all of them. He never read all of them. He had trusted Caleb to present him with only what required his signature. He had signed it, which meant the divorce had his real authorization, even if it had been obtained through concealment, which meant Elena had been put on that curb with $11 under a document that bore his real signature, even if he hadn't understood what he was signing. He looked at the phone in Caleb's hand. He looked at Caleb's face. And something happened in the room then that nobody had anticipated, least of all Caleb. Elena's voice came through the warehouse speaker system. Not her physical voice, a recording, playing through the terminal's old PA, scratchy and compressed but entirely intelligible, and what it was playing was a phone call. Specific phone call. 6 minutes and 40 seconds long, with a timestamp from 14 months ago, and the two voices on it were Caleb Rourke and a man named Dermot Hale, who had been identified in Daniel's records as the intermediary contact for the vehicle that had gone off Route 9 into the reservoir. Call played. It was very clear. It played for 6 minutes and 40 seconds while everyone in the warehouse stood in the positions they occupied and listened. And Caleb's face went through several things in that 6 minutes and 40 seconds control. Then calculation. Then something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. Finally, a blankness that was the face of a man who has understood that the architecture he spent 15 years building has just been walked through by someone who found the door he thought he'd hidden. Recording ended. The PA clicked off. From somewhere in the building above them, a door opened. Footsteps on metal stairs. Elena came through the operations corridor door onto the warehouse floor with the lockbox under her arm and her coat dark at the shoulder where she'd caught the edge of something on the way through. And her knee was visibly wrong. She was putting less weight on it than the other, each step carrying a slight hitch. And she looked like someone who has been awake for 24 hours, and in motion for the last 6 of them, which is to say, she looked exhausted and damaged and entirely purposeful. She had a secondary device in her hand. She looked at Caleb on the catwalk. The router was offline, she said. So I used the PA system. She held up the device. Call record was in the lockbox. Analog playback through the PA. Doesn't need a network connection. She looked at him steadily. Every faction head in the organization has a copy of the financial records. Priya's archive is locked and biometrically protected. And what they just heard through that speaker is going to be the first thing. Everyone in this building is asked about when the police arrive in approximately 60 seconds. Caleb looked at her. He looked at the phone in his own hand, the divorce authorization, the real signature. He looked at Adrian. The 2 catwalk men were looking at each other. "We're done," said the one on the left, not to Caleb, not to Adrian. Just said it into the air of the warehouse as a statement of personal accounting. And then he put his weapon on the catwalk rail and stepped back. The second man did the same thing 4 seconds later. Caleb stood alone on the catwalk. He looked down at Adrian and Elena standing on the warehouse floor, 20 feet below him, and his face had gone through everything it had to go through and arrived, somewhere quiet and final, and stripped of the performance he'd maintained for 15 years. "The divorce papers," he said. His voice was very even. "The authorization exists. Whatever else happens, that signature is real. You did that, Adrian. That's on you." "Yes," Adrian said. "It is." Caleb looked at him. "Then you lost her once on your own," Caleb said. "Before I ever touched the paperwork." Adrian held his gaze. "I know," he said. "Outside. Sirens." Caleb gripped the catwalk rail with both hands, and for one moment, just one, he looked less like the architect of a 15-year betrayal, and more like a man in his late 50s at 5A. In a dead building above the water, holding onto a railing, looking down at the distance to the floor. Then he straightened. He put the phone in his coat. He looked at Adrian one more time. "The things I did for this organization," he started. "Don't," Adrian said. "Not now, not to me." Caleb closed his mouth. The sirens were close 1 block, maybe 2, and the red-blue light was beginning to pulse through the warehouse's high windows, strobing across the metal ceiling in cold, alternating flashes. And Elena was standing next to Adrian now, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her through the cold air, and she was looking at the catwalk with her jaw set and her hands still, and nothing in her face that looked like triumph. Because this was never something she had wanted to win. She had wanted it to stop. Garrett moved to cover the loading bay entrance. The warehouse doors began to open, and Caleb, at the rail, looked at Elena with something that had too many components to name not apology, not quite hatred, something older than both, and said, almost quietly, "You should have left when he gave you the chance." Elena looked up at him. "He never gave me a chance," she said. "He gave me a door. I chose to stay on the other side of it." First officers came through the loading bay with flashlights and commands, and the warehouse filled with light and noise, and the specific organized chaos of law enforcement arriving at a scene that has already resolved itself in most of the ways that matter. And Caleb stood at the catwalk rail and did not move, and Adrian stood on the warehouse floor and did not move, and Elena stood beside him with the lockbox and the envelope and a bad knee and the accumulated weight of 14 months of doing something very difficult in the most alone way possible. Adrian's hand found hers. Not a gesture, not a statement, just the specific physical fact of a person reaching for another person in a cold building at 5 in the morning when the worst of it is over and what comes next is going to be its own kind of hard. Elena looked at their hands. Then she looked at the catwalk. Caleb was being walked down the stairs by 2 officers, and he did not look back, and there was something almost dignified about that. And Elena hated that it was there, because dignity in the wrong place is just another kind of performance, and she had seen enough of those for one lifetime. She looked away. She looked at Adrian. His face was doing several things at once, exhausted, resolved, something else that was just beginning to surface through the fatigue like a shape becoming visible in clearing water, and he was looking at her with it, not hiding it, which was new. From outside, more vehicles. Garrett's people had arrived. The Marlowe security team filtered in through the perimeter in their professional, quiet way, and the balance of the building shifted from uncertain to contained, and somewhere in the operational machinery of what would come next statements. Documentation, the legal architecture of making Caleb Rourke's exposure stick in ways that couldn't be walked back. Everything Elena had assembled over 14 months was going to finally do what it had been assembled to do. That was next. Right now, there was just the warehouse and the cold and the red-blue light through the high windows and Adrian's hand around hers, and Caleb going through the loading bay door between 2 officers without looking back, and Priya sitting on a crate with a first aid kit someone had found, pressing gauze to the cut above her eyebrow with the focused irritation of someone who considers getting hit in the face an organizational failure and intends to write a full incident report about it. Elena almost laughed. It came out instead as a single exhale, long, unsteady at the edges, the kind of breath you take when you have been holding the previous one for 14 months. Adrian heard it. He looked at her. She looked back. "The divorce papers," she said. "The real authorization. I signed something I didn't read," he said. "That's mine." "I know what it is, Elena." She waited. "I didn't want the divorce," he said. "I didn't know that was what I was signing. But I also," he stopped, restarted. "I let it happen. I let enough distance build between us that Caleb could put a document in front of me and I'd sign it without asking what it was. That's not on him." He looked at her directly. "That's mine." Elena stood in the warehouse light and held his gaze and felt the specific weight of being told the true version of something, after a very long time of operating around the absence of it. "Yes," she said, "it is." He held her gaze. Neither of them said anything else for a moment, and in the space that created, the whole shape of the next conversation was visible, the one that would happen somewhere else, somewhere quieter, when the lawyers were done and the statements were given, and the machinery of consequence had begun to process Caleb Rourke and the Malta structure and 15 years of built-up debt between 2 families who had been burning each other down over a foundation they'd both helped pour. That conversation was going to be long and honest and difficult in ways that neither of them had the vocabulary for yet. But it was there, waiting, on the other side of tonight. Garrett appeared at Adrian's shoulder. "Local attorneys are 20 minutes out. We need to get Priya looked at and have the documentation prepared before they arrive." He paused. "And you both need to sit down before one of you falls down." Adrian looked at Garrett's arm. You first, Adrian said. I drove here on this arm, Garrett said. I'll manage 20 more minutes. Priya stood up from the crate, gauze pressed to her eyebrow, and walked over to Elena with the specific directness of someone who has been waiting to say something. The biometric lock, she said. Yes, Elena said. I added it at 4:23 a.m. on my own initiative. Adrian hadn't asked for it. I know, I did it, because the records were too important to leave at single credential access. She paused. And because I've been watching the financial anomalies for 6 weeks, and I wasn't sure how far the compromise went. She looked at Elena steadily. You were the only person in the organization whose financial activity was completely clean. Elena looked at her. Thank you, she said. Priya nodded once and went to find somewhere to sit. Outside, the sirens had gone quiet. The sky above the warehouse's high windows had shifted not full light yet, but the absolute dark was gone, replaced by the deep gray blue of a morning that is committed to arriving whether anyone is ready for it or not. Adrian looked at the window. He looked at the space where Caleb had been on the catwalk. He looked at Elena. It's not over, he said. It wasn't despair, just accurate. No, she said. But the part that needed to happen here is... He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the exchange of information. Then he turned toward the loading bay where the attorneys were going to arrive. In 19 minutes, and Elena fell into step beside him, and her knee protested every step across the warehouse floor, and she did not show it, and he could tell she wasn't showing it, and he slowed his pace by exactly 1/2 step without commenting on it. She said nothing. They walked toward the door together, and behind them, the warehouse stood empty of everything it had held. Tonight, the threat. The standoff, 15 years of Caleb Rourke's particular architecture, quarter of loyalty, and betrayal, and ahead of them the morning was coming up cold and real over the East River, and whatever it held was going to be a different kind of hard than the night had been. Kind of hard that happens after the crisis, when the people involved have to look at each other in ordinary light and decide what they actually are to each other. Still coming. But so was the morning. And for the first time since 2:17 a.m., when a woman had walked out of a penthouse with a dead phone and $11 into the Manhattan rain, the next thing was not something designed by Caleb Rourke. It was just whatever came next. The attorneys arrived in 18 minutes, not 20. 3 of them from a firm Adrian had used for legitimate corporate matters. People who had no connection to Caleb's network, which was the first thing Adrian had verified when he'd made the call from the car. They came through the loading bay in good coats, looking slightly stunned by the geography of where they'd been asked to come at 5:20 in the morning, and the senior partner, a trim woman in her 50s named Carol Ash, took one look at the warehouse interior, the 2 men still zip-tied on the floor, the officers moving through the space, Priya with gauze on her face, Adrian with blood dried on his sleeve, and said nothing about any of it. She opened her briefcase and asked for the documentation. Elena gave her the envelope. Carol Ash sat on an overturned crate and read for 11 minutes without looking up. When she finished, she looked at Priya. The digital archive. Locked and time-stamped, Priya said. I can provide access credentials to any court-authorized recipient. The biometric lock means the chain of custody is clean. Nothing has been altered since the archive was sealed. Carol looked at Adrian. The call recording that was played through the PA system. Original file is on the device, Elena said. She held up the secondary phone. Time-stamped metadata intact. The lockbox it came from has been in my possession. Continuously, I can document the access chain back 14 months. Carol looked at the lockbox. She looked at Elena. You've been building this for 14 months, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes. While residing in the marital home. Yes. Carol absorbed that without visible judgment, which was why Adrian paid her firm what he paid them. The Malta account documentation. The Santoro Incorporation document. The one establishing that the Santoro signatory block was a subsequent alteration. You have the original. In the envelope. Carol looked back at the envelope in her hands. She held it with the particular careful grip of someone who understands that what they're holding is going to be in a courtroom for a significant portion of the next several years. The man in custody, she said. Caleb Rourke, Adrian said. head of security for Voss International Security for 15 years. His arrest tonight will be on the immediate charges: kidnapping, criminal conspiracy, the firearms situation in this warehouse. Financial crimes are federal and will take longer. They'll take considerably longer, Carol said. I want to be direct with you about that. The Malta structure, the transfer documentation, building a federal case on offshore financial crime at this scale is a 2 to 3 year process minimum. I know, Adrian said. Caleb Rourke has resources. He'll have counsel within the hour. I know that too. Carol looked at him steadily. What do you want the outcome to be? Adrian was quiet for a moment. He looked at Priya. He looked at Garrett, who had finally let someone wrap his arm and was sitting against the wall, with his eyes closed and the specific expression of a man conserving everything he has left. He looked at Elena, who was standing slightly apart from the main group. Her weight shifted off her left knee, watching the first gray light come through the high warehouse windows. I want the financial structure completely exposed and legally prosecuted, he said. I want Daniel Marlowe's death connected to the people responsible through the proper legal channels. I want the Malta accounts frozen and the documentation transferred to the Federal Financial Crimes Division. He paused. And I want the record to show that the Santoro organization was falsely implicated in the original account structure. The corrected incorporation document establishes that. Carol raised an eyebrow. That's an unusual thing for someone in your position to request. It's accurate, Adrian said. I'm not in the business of letting false records stand because they're convenient. Carol wrote something in her notebook. She wrote for a while. Then she looked up and said, to no one in particular, and to the room in general, I'm going to need coffee. The legal machinery took 4 hours to begin moving in any visible direction. Statements were given. Documents were inventoried and logged. The Federal Financial Crimes Division was contacted through a channel Carol Ash had used before, and 2 agents arrived at the warehouse by 8 a.m. with the specific careful demeanor of people who are trying to understand the size of what they've just been handed. Priya walked them through the archive access with a cut above her eye and a coffee in her hand, and the patience of someone who has explained complex financial structures to non-specialists many times before. Caleb had counsel by 6:15, as Carol had predicted. The counsel's first call was to Adrian, directly a professional courtesy that was also a probe, testing the shape of the opposition, and Adrian let it go to voicemail. Elena had her knee looked at by a paramedic who arrived with the 2nd Police Unit. The verdict was a moderate ligament, strain painful, not structural, manageable with rest and an ice pack, neither of which she was going to get for several more hours. The paramedic gave her a compression wrap, and she sat on the same overturned crate Carol had used for the document review and let the paramedic work and looked at the warehouse floor. Adrian sat next to her, not close enough to require acknowledgement, just there, in the adjacent space, both of them facing the same direction, watching the room operate around them. The Santoro request, Elena said after a while. Caruso's original document establishes they were framed, Adrian said. Correcting a false record is not a favor. It's accurate. Mark Santoro asked me for something in exchange for that document, she said. He was quiet, waiting. He asked that when this is over, the dismantling stops, that his organization is left alone to transition out in its own time. She kept her eyes on the middle distance. I told him I couldn't make that promise for you. Adrian was quiet for a moment. What did you tell him for yourself? She looked at him sideways. I told him I heard him, she said. Adrian looked at the warehouse floor. He knew about the easement, he said. He had people on the street at Fidelity. He's been watching you for 6 months. He paused. He was positioned to help you, whether I came around or not. Yes, because he calculated that you were the most likely path to ending this without a war. Yes. Adrian was quiet again. A longer quiet this time, the kind that is doing actual work rather than filling space. The dismantling was already mostly done, he said finally. 4 years of pressure on what was left of their operation. There's not much structural capacity remaining. Stopping now versus continuing for another year gets the same outcome. He paused, with considerably less cost. Elena looked at him. It's not a favor, he said. It's accurate. She almost smiled. He saw it and something in his own face moved. In response, not quite a smile either, but in the same neighborhood. They sat in the warehouse on adjacent crates while the legal apparatus moved around them. And outside the high windows, the sky went from gray-blue to the particular flat white of a full overcast morning, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the silence was the most honest thing between them since she'd walked out of the penthouse 12 hours ago. 3 weeks later, Carol Ash called with the first significant update. Elena took the call in the office. She'd been using, at the legitimate arm of Voss International, a corner room on the 31st floor, with a view of the Hudson, spare and functional, the previous occupant's personal items long since cleared out. She'd been in the room for 11 days, which was 7 days longer than she'd initially agreed to be, and she was beginning to understand that the initial timeline had been optimistic in the way that initial timelines for large structural changes always are. The federal filing is confirmed, Carol said. The Malta account freeze went through international channels faster than I expected. The Maltese Financial Authority cooperated almost immediately once we produced the incorporation document. The accounts are frozen as of this morning. How much? Elena said. Full balance across the connected accounts is approximately 41 million. That's what Caleb accumulated over 9 years of running the structure for himself. A pause. The original Thomas Voss transactions, the ones involving your family's subsidiary, those accounts are long since closed. The money there has been gone for 16 years. I want to be honest with you that there's no realistic mechanism for recovering that. I know, Elena said. The call recording connecting Rourke to the intermediary in your brother's case has been transferred to the homicide investigation. The detective assigned has described the recording as her words, the cleanest piece of posthumous evidence she's seen in 12 years. A pause. It's not a guarantee of prosecution. Nothing is. But it's significant. Elena looked at the Hudson. The river was gray today, moving fast under a low sky, and she watched it for a moment without speaking. Daniel, she said. The investigator will contact you directly, Carol said. She wanted to speak with you personally. I told her you were available. Yes, Elena said. I am. After the call ended, she sat with the phone in her hand and looked at the river and thought about Daniel the way she allowed herself to think about him, when she wasn't in the middle of managing something not the version of him from the phone call. 14 months ago, telling her what he'd found, with the careful, thorough excitement of someone who they've found the solution to a problem. The earlier version, the one from before the feud, had made everything expensive. Daniel at 23, sitting on the hood of a car outside their parents' house, explaining to her why the two families didn't have to keep doing this to each other, why it was a choice rather than a condition. He had been right. It had just taken considerably longer than he'd planned for the evidence to catch up with the argument. She put the phone face down on the desk. She went back to work. Adrian appeared in the doorway of her office at 4 p.m. She hadn't heard him coming. He moved quietly when he chose to, which was most of the time, and she looked up from the restructuring documents she'd been reviewing, and he was just that there. In the doorway, coat on, looking slightly worn, in the way he'd looked continuously since the warehouse, but functional the way a building looks after a significant storm, when the damage has been assessed and the decision to repair has been made. Carol called me too, he said, I assumed. He came into the office. He didn't sit. He stood at the window and looked at the Hudson, and she watched his profile. The board meeting is Thursday, he said. The legitimate subsidiary leadership, the security consulting arm, the risk management division, the 3 infrastructure contracts, all of it needs new operational governance. Caleb's access has been revoked across every system, but the structural gaps he left behind are significant. He paused. I've been asked by the board to recommend an interim chief executive for the legitimate business operations while the restructuring completes. Elena kept her expression neutral. Who are you recommending? He looked at her. I think you know, he said. She held his gaze. Adrian, you've been running the restructuring for 11 days, he said. Board has seen the preliminary framework you produced. Carol has seen the evidentiary organization you built over 14 months, while simultaneously managing a marriage that was being actively sabotaged. He turned from the window to face her fully. You're better at this than I am. That's not self-deprecation. It's accurate. The board isn't going to accept someone whose connection to this organization is a marriage that was legally questionable for 3 weeks. The divorce papers are void, he said. Carol confirmed the authorization I signed was obtained through material misrepresentation. Papers were never valid. We're still married. He paused, which is a separate conversation. But as far as the board is concerned, you are Mrs. Voss. And you have demonstrated a degree of strategic and operational capability that most of them have spent their careers looking for and not finding. Elena looked at him. She looked at the desk in front of her, the restructuring documents, the preliminary framework she'd been working through, the organizational chart she'd been mapping, with the particular focused attention of someone who has been waiting a long time to be in a room where she could work on the actual problem instead of working around it. Criminal side, she said, completely separate entity. Already in the process of legal dissolution, Carol is managing the extraction. He held her gaze. What remains after that is a legitimate international security consulting operation with 47 employees, 3 major infrastructure contracts, and a governance crisis I don't have the skill set to resolve without a year of expensive mistakes. You have the skill set. I have the appetite for risk management and the operational instincts, he said. I don't have your patience for institutional architecture. I never did, he paused. My father didn't either. That was half the problem. Elena looked at the window. The Hudson was still gray. The other half of the problem, she said carefully, was that your father built something he couldn't control on top of something he'd deliberately corrupted, and then left a man he trusted more than he trusted you to manage the gap between the two. Adrian was quiet. That's not a criticism of him, she said. Just what happened. I know what it is, he said. They were quiet for a moment. He left me the legitimate side because he thought it was the safer part, Adrian said. He left Caleb the real architecture because he thought Caleb could carry it indefinitely without anyone finding out. He looked at his hands briefly. He underestimated how much Caleb would eventually resent being the caretaker of something that wasn't his. People who maintain other people's power for long enough always do, Elena said. It's not complicated. No, he looked at her. It's not. Another quiet. This one had a different texture from the warehouse. Quiet, less raw, more considered. The silence of people who have been through something together and are in the early stages of understanding what that means going forward. The board meeting is Thursday, he said again. I heard you the first time. Will you be there? She looked at him. Yes, she said. Something in his face settled, not relief exactly. Something quieter and more durable than relief. He turned toward the door. The Marlowe family trust, he said without turning back. The one your grandfather built with my father. The original partnership before the feud. She waited. The offshore account is frozen. But the legal entity of the trust itself, the original incorporation, is still technically active. Carol found it in the documentation. He paused. I don't know what you want to do with that. Elena looked at the window. Neither do I yet, she said. Give me some time. He nodded without turning around. He left. She looked at the Hudson for a long time after he was gone. The detective assigned to Daniel's case was a woman named Ruth Carey, compact, direct, in her mid-40s, with the specific, unhurried manner of someone who I learned that rushing homicide investigations produces worse outcomes than the waiting is worth. She met Elena in a conference room at the 76th Precinct on a Wednesday morning, a week after Carol's call. She had a file in front of her that was considerably thicker than Elena had expected. We've been looking at your brother's accident since the year it happened, Detective Carey said. Not continuously. We reopened it 18 months ago when an unrelated investigation produced a name that appeared in both files. The name was Dermot Hale. Elena's hands were still on the table. You know that name, Carey said. He's in the call record, Elena said. He's in several things, Carey said. He's currently in federal custody on unrelated charges in New Jersey, which has made him considerably more willing to discuss his history than he might otherwise be. She opened the file. He confirmed the commission. The call record you provided is consistent with his account. The vehicle, the timing, the Route 9 location, all confirmed. She looked at Elena. He says he never met Rourke in person. Everything was conducted through intermediaries and the phone. He was paid from an account we've now connected to the Malta structure. Elena sat with that. What happens now, she said. Rourke's counsel is going to argue that a recorded call and a testimony from a federal detainee with his own charges pending is insufficient for a murder charge. Carrie's voice was flat and factual. They're not wrong that it's an uphill case. But the financial connection, the payment trail from the Malta account to Hale, that's documentary evidence, and it's clean. We're building around it. She paused. I want to be honest with you. This will take time. It may not resolve the way you want it to resolve. Will it resolve? Elena said. Carrie looked at her directly. Yes, she said. In one form or another it will resolve. Rourke is facing federal financial charges that are going to produce a significant sentence regardless of what happens with this case. But I am going to do everything I can to make sure Daniel's name is in the record, officially, connected to the people responsible. She paused. That's what I can offer you right now. Elena looked at the file on the table. She thought about Daniel on the hood of a car at 23, explaining why things didn't have to be the way they were. He was trying to stop all of this, she said. When he found the account, he wasn't trying to use it. He was trying to bring it to the people who could end it. I know, Carrie said. That's in the record, too. Elena sat in the conference room for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she stood up, and she thanked Detective Carey, and she walked out into the November Street and stood on the sidewalk in the cold for a moment, with her hands in her coat pockets and her face tipped slightly toward the gray sky. And she breathed. Just breathed, in and out. The street moved around her, a delivery truck, 2 people walking fast. Cab, all of it, indifferent and continuous and alive, in the specific ordinary way of a city that has been going about its business since before any of this particular trouble started and will continue going about it after. She breathed. Then she went back to work. The board meeting on Thursday lasted 4 hours. Elena spoke for 40 minutes of it, presenting the restructuring framework she'd been building for 11 days, with the concision of someone who respects the time of the people she's presenting to and the confidence of someone whom knows the material completely. The board asked questions. She answered them. Adrian sat at the head of the table and said almost nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because watching her work in a room was its own form of clarity, and he had decided somewhere in the past 3 weeks to stop filling silences that didn't need him in them. The vote was 8-1. The dissenting vote was a board member who had been appointed on Caleb's recommendation 6 years ago and whose own position was now under legal review. His objection was noted and filed. After the meeting, in the corridor outside the boardroom, Adrian walked beside Elena toward the elevator and said nothing for 3 floors of dissent. In the lobby, he stopped. She stopped. The Marlowe Family Trust, he said. She looked at him. I want to dissolve it, he said, formally, through the proper legal channels, not because of what it contains, because of what it represents. He held her gaze. 2 families built something together and then spent 16 years trying to destroy each other over it. I don't want that entity to exist anymore. Not as a legal structure. Not as anything. Elena looked at him. The original partnership, she said carefully, for the feud. Before Thomas turned on your grandfather. Yes. Dissolving it doesn't change what happened. No, he said, but it closes the account. Formally. So that nobody inherits it. Elena stood in the lobby of the building that was now in a legal and operational sense that would take another 6 months to fully settle, partly hers to run. She looked at the man she was still married to, and she thought about the word he just used. Inherit. Nobody inherits it. That was what Daniel had been trying to do. Close this account so that the next generation didn't start where this one had. He'd just tried to do it too fast and too alone, and it had cost him everything. She thought about that for a moment. Then dissolve it, she said. I'll tell Carol. Adrian nodded. They stood in the lobby. There's a conversation we haven't had, he said. There are several, she said. The one about whether this, he stopped. Started again. Whether what's happening in that office on the 31st floor is a professional arrangement or something else. Elena looked at him steadily. The lobby was not empty. There were people moving through it, a security desk, 2 people waiting for a meeting. None of that was relevant. What do you want it to be? She said. He held her gaze. I don't think I get to want things yet, he said. I think I have a significant amount of accounting to do first. For the marriage, I let Caleb poison. For the papers, I signed without reading. For 2 years of distance I could have closed and didn't. He paused. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm telling you I know what the list is. Elena looked at him. She had spent 14 months doing something very difficult in the most solitary way possible. And she had done it not for recognition, and not for gratitude, and not for any outcome she could have predicted on the other side of it. And she was standing in a lobby that smelled of floor wax and cold air from the revolving doors, and the man in front of her was telling her he knew his list. That was not nothing. The Thursday board meetings are at 2, she said. I'll need your operational sign-off on the infrastructure contracts by end of day Friday each week. She paused. We can have the other conversation after the restructuring settles. Time. Something in his face opened the way it had on the runway, at the airfield, when she'd handed him the lockbox, that specific opening, that's not softness, but was the thing that happens to a person's face when they stop maintaining a distance that was always costing more than it was worth. Yes, he said, there is. 6 weeks later, on a morning that was cold and clear, in the specific way that December mornings in New York are, when the weather finally decides to commit, Elena stood on a private runway at the same airfield where none of this had been simple. She had the battered brown suitcase. She'd kept it. The Goyard luggage was in a storage unit somewhere. Kept the original suitcase because it was hers, bought before any of this. Before the marriage, before the Malta account and Caleb Rourke, and 14 months of careful, dangerous patience, and it still worked. And she saw no reason to replace a thing that still worked simply because of what it had been carrying. She was taking 2 weeks. The restructuring was at a point where 2 weeks was possible, barely. If Priya held the operational thread while she was gone, which Priya had agreed to do with the specific business-like competence of someone who finds the idea of holding an operational thread for 2 weeks considerably simpler than being kidnapped and pistol whipped in a shipping terminal. The jet was her family's, the same one that had landed at this airfield the night that had started everything. She'd arranged it herself. She heard footsteps on the tarmac behind her. Adrian. He stopped beside her. Not behind her. Beside. He had a set of keys in his hand. He held them out. She looked at the keys. Small, simple. A plain key ring. What are these? She said. The office on 31, he said. The building management gave me a set to pass along when the lease transferred to your name. She looked at him. The board voted to transfer the executive lease to the CEO, he said. That's you now. Officially as of this morning. He paused. I thought you should have the physical keys. She took the keys. She held them in her palm and looked at them. I thought you were going to say the jet was mine, she said. He looked at the jet, then at her. That jet is yours too, he said. It always was. Your family sent it. A pause. I just never understood that until recently. Elena closed her hand around the keys. She looked at the sky, cold, blue, the kind of blue that is only possible in December when the air has been scoured clean by the first real cold of the season. I'll be back in 2 weeks, she said. I know. She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon, and his profile in the morning light was tired and honest and not performing anything. And that was what she had wanted from him for 2 years, not the managed version, not the controlled operational face, just the actual person underneath it, with his actual list of things he owed, and his actual understanding of how long it was going to take to pay them. It was not a resolution. It was a beginning, which is both smaller and harder than a resolution, because a resolution is an ending, and an ending has a shape you can hold, but a beginning is just the first step of something you can't see the length of yet. She picked up the suitcase. The Santoro request, she said. Marcus Santoro, the arrangement I described. I'll honor it, he said. The transition timeline he asked for 18 months. I'll hold the pressure through that window. Thank you. It's accurate, he said. She almost laughed. She walked toward the jet. At the stairs, she stopped. Not to look back, she didn't look back. She just stopped for a moment, the way you stop at the end of something, to let your body understand it before you move on. And she stood in the cold December air, with the suitcase in her hand, and the keys in her coat pocket, and the Hudson visible in the distance beyond the terminal fence. Daniel would have said something useful here. Something clear and slightly too optimistic and right. The way he always was right about the shape of things. even when the execution was messier than he'd planned. He would have said that the point was never the money or the empire or the account in Malta. The point was the next generation, not inheriting the debt. He'd been right. He was right about most things. She went up the stairs. The jet lifted into the December sky. 20 minutes later, climbing east over the city, and from above Manhattan looked, the way it always looks, from altitude orderly and contained. The grid of it making sense from up here in a way it doesn't always make from inside it. Adrian stood on the runway and watched it go. He stood there for a while, after it had cleared the visible sky, hands in his pockets, looking at the place where the jet had been, and then he looked at the runway surface, and then he looked at nothing in particular for a moment, in the way that people look at nothing when they are actually looking at themselves. Then he turned and walked back toward the terminal. He had a full day of work ahead of him, legitimate, documented, the kind of work that doesn't require a secondary phone or a fabricated authorization or a careful calculation about who in the room is running which version of the truth. Just work. The kind that either produces results or doesn't, and that leaves an honest record either way. He walked into the terminal. Inside his coat pocket, his hand brushed something he hadn't put there. Stopped. He reached in. It was a small photograph, printed, not digital. The kind that requires intention to produce in a world where everything lives on a screen. He didn't recognize it at first, and then he did, the two of them, at an event from the first year of their marriage, before everything had been complicated by what he hadn't known and she hadn't been able to say yet. She was looking at something off camera. He was looking at her, with an expression he had no memory of making, and the expression was uncomplicated. The expression of a man who has not yet learned to manage what he feels about the person standing next to him. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he put it back in his coat. He went inside. And outside, the December sky was clear and blue and enormous, and somewhere above it, a jet was crossing toward the open water, carrying a woman with a battered suitcase and a bad knee and 2 weeks of time that belonged entirely to her. And the city below went about its morning, the way cities do indifferent to individual resolution, continuous and loud and entirely unimpressed by the fact that something had ended and something else had begun, in the particular quiet way that real things end and begin, without ceremony, without announcement, just the next moment arriving after the last one, the way moments do, regardless of what they cost.